And so I'm honored to be moderating this final panel on the important topic of the effect of COVID-19 on individuals with opioid use disorder. The COVID-19 pandemic has obviously altered many aspects of our lives, including how we obtain medical care and interact with the people who provide us with support. Although these challenges affect all of us, they can be particularly problematic to individuals with opioid use disorder who are in recovery or who are trying to get into recovery. The American Medical Association reported in July that several states have observed increased rates of overdose since the pandemic took hold in the spring. Studies have also shown that people who have opioid use disorder are more susceptible to some of the adverse health effects of COVID-19. In counterpoint to those sobering facts stand the creative responses of our courts, our community mental health providers, our community treatment providers, our recovery community, and legal aid providers. We're going to learn about that critical work from our fantastic panel of speakers, and I hope leave this forum with an increased appreciation for the work people are doing in continued service to this vulnerable population. I'm really excited to introduce our panelists. We have with us today Brendan Wood, who is an Equal Justice Text to Give Fellow and attorney at Legal Aid of West Virginia. He provides direct representation, comprehensive support and counseling, and community capacity building education to West Virginians who are recovering from substance use disorders. We have Lois Vance, who is the Medication Assisted Treatment Clinic Manager at Cabin Creek Health Clinic. Lois is a nationally certified addiction care coordinator and a certified peer recovery support specialist. Lois and Brendan, thank you for joining us. I wish we were able to actually be there in West Virginia as we had intended. Our other two speakers are from the great state of Indiana. We have Brandon George, who is the Vice President for Recovery, Advocacy, and Programs for Mental Health America of Indiana, as well as the Director of Indiana Addiction Issues Coalition. He served as a trusted advisor to the National Judicial Opioid Task Force, as a consultant for SAMHSA's Opioid Response Network, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and he recently spoke at the White House for the Office of National Drug Control Policy. And Brandon is apparently in some amazing, brilliantly beautiful location. Not sure where you're calling in from. I hope you'll tell us when your turn is up. And last but not least, we have the wonderful Chief Justice Loretta Rush of the Indiana Supreme Court. Chief Justice Rush has served on the Indiana Supreme Court since 2014. She served as the Vice President of the Conference of Chief Justices Board of Directors, is a member of the National Center for State Courts Board of Directors, and led the response efforts to the opioid epidemic as co-chair of the National Judicial Opioid Task Force. Brandon and Chief Justice Rush both served on LSC's opioid task force, which wrapped up its work last year, and we will provide a link to the task force's final report in the chat. So I want to start with Chief Justice Rush. Chief Justice, welcome. We're glad you're here with us. And we've recognized and appreciated you as a leader in ensuring that courts understand the science of opioid use disorder and that they're more responsive to the needs of people with opioid use disorder. Could you tell us how COVID-19 has impacted the Indiana court's ability to interact with individuals who have opioid use disorder?
Thank you. I want to thank Legal Services for putting this together, and also thank them for the work that they did on the opioid issue. It's easy to think that this is just a criminal justice issue, but it really affects almost every docket that goes on in the court. So my answer to the question, Stephanie, is not going to be just Indiana centric, because I've been working on some national panels through the Conference of Chief Justice. We have a pandemic, a rapid response groups that are working with vulnerable populations. There's a lot on the website for help, but in trying to pull the justice system along on this issue and understanding the disease of addiction, the disease component of addiction, that it's not a moral failure. You've got to train judges on the science of addiction. You've got to train probation officers, community corrections. It's a lot of the justice partners. So in working with that, the court was really getting, we did trainings all over the country. We have a toolkit that's available online that has easy pull out things about medication-based treatment for judge, for adolescents, for pregnant women. It's got probably 30 different deliverables. And then everything just kind of crashed when COVID hit. We had to figure out how we're going to deliver services. We also, and I want just to back up for introduction, I want to tell you that the Conference of Chief Justices right now is doing the same thing for mental health that we did for substance abuse. We have and I serve as on the executive board of the National Mental Health Task Force because it's the overarching behavioral health needs of the people. A lot of people come to court not with just one. It might be co-occurring, it might be mental health, it might be substance abuse. So you can't deal with one or the other. You can't just say, well, let's just put them all in problem-solving courts because it affects civil dockets, divorce, evictions, collections, and that. So we're working on that. So when it hit, we all know the numbers. Here's just a little snapshot. The first couple of weeks in Indianapolis, 43% increase in EMS calls, 61% in calls for administering naloxone, and drug overdoses increased by 47%. And Indianapolis is not unique. It might be the crossroads of America, but we're seeing these numbers. So you look at people coming to court and delivering legal services, whether it's in a criminal context, whether it's a family law case, whether it's a child welfare case, whether it's a collection case, it just wasn't being done in the traditional way. Then we had a lot of low risk, nonviolent people suffering from SUD and OUD sitting in jail in the middle of COVID because they were poor and couldn't afford bond. So we had to ramp up and deal with a lot of those issues with regard to releasing. But where are you releasing them to? I mean, where are you releasing them to a safe environment? So those issues we had to look to. So the courts had to change their model. We purchased Zoom licenses, 800 Zoom licenses for our judges. We also worked with our legal services. They had a lot of questions. Our legal services wrote the court and said, listen, we have all these concerns. What's going to happen if a creditor attaches CARES money? What's going to happen with regard to a myriad of issues with their clientele? And so we work very closely with them. So what do you do when you have somebody struggling with addictions in a family recovery court or a problem-solving court that's doing it virtually? Well, we know that the nature of suffering from the disease of addiction, that isolation is just horrible. So you're conducting these hearings virtually. For a while there, nobody was drug screening. And again, you're not drug screening to lock up, you're drug screening with regard to work with them in their recovery. Treatment stopped. Self-help, the group stopped. So we had to figure out a different way of bringing those services. So how do you use technology? We had to find different ways to chemically test and collection practices, how you send homework to participants in court with regard to email. We did things with our, some of our judges were very creative. They set book clubs, recovery-based book clubs, and the judge would be there during the problem-solving court hearings and talking about that. They established sort of online fitness programs for the people. Self-help and case management meetings were held in alternative locations. We had graduations held in barns, of course we're Indiana. We purchased activities for families like puzzles and crosswords. We asked for weekly reports from team members. We had to find funding to purchase prepaid phones to make sure, and this goes with the previous session. We designated an on-call phone that allowed participants to access a case manager. So we had to change a lot of it to sort of deal with people struggling with addiction, particularly in the problem context, and things did stand still. I think they're ramping back up. I just saw a problem-solving court that graduation that was online. We are live streaming hearings that you can go on the Indiana Court website and just watch a hearing so that we have that transparency. But COVID really has affected, and what I'm very concerned about is the fact that we have so many people suffering from the disease of addiction, it's fallen off the radar. People don't talk about it anymore. We're losing people all the time. And where are they? Where are their advocates? Where are their voices? So the courts have had to pivot. We're looking at family recovery courts and child welfare cases, how we present those. We love medical legal partnerships. Maybe somebody else is going to talk about those, where we embed legal services in a medical provider so you can have a holistic means of providing. So there's just a little intro, Stephanie.
That's a bunch of wonderful information to hear, and I'm glad you were able to provide some of the national perspective on it. Have the courts seen an increased prevalence of opioid use disorder in the cases before them? Meaning, is it a factor in more housing cases or family law cases than you had seen previously?
Well, we had the eviction moratorium for a while and now it's ramping up. But yes, I mean, I think we're seeing different kinds of synthetic drugs too. We're seeing some very dangerous, deadly drugs in that gambit. But they have. So again, the courts have to do things like pivot. We have an online landlord tenant free facilitation program where I got some CARES money and we're able to, instead of going and getting that eviction or going to court, you can pivot around it. We've changed our Coalition for Court Access, our online tools to make it more user-friendly, list questions and answers, and we're putting together videos so unrepresented litigants can better understand the process. And then we're also sending out as much as we can in training, because sometimes the attorneys or some other community members, it's a first contact before court. We're downstream in court. How do we educate them on best practices and the tools that are available that are successful? Understanding math. You'll still have judges, can't believe it, that don't understand medication-based treatment that is the gold standard with regard to opioid use disorder. So we continually have to repeat and repeat and repeat those messages. But yes, we're seeing in visitation cases, we're seeing in child welfare cases, collection cases, housing cases, guardianship cases, bankruptcy cases. There's hardly a case that you can't find some element that substance abuse hasn't touched.
Thank you. Brandon, I want to turn to you to build off of the discussion we were just having with Chief Justice Rush, talking about some of the effects that isolation has had and the ways that the court system has come up with to both help remedy that issue and also to connect individuals with the services that they need. What are you hearing from your constituents about their challenges and what kinds of service adjustments are working for them?
Thanks, Stephanie. And thank you to LSC for the invitation to talk with everybody today and the general attention you all give with lifting this topic up on how people with SUD are affected by legal aid needs, and especially during COVID. COVID has presented a really unique challenge for people with substance use disorder, and it has impacted people in a variety of ways, and some of them less than others, but impacted nevertheless. You know, we talked about, Chief Justice Rush talked about the isolation piece for people with substance use disorder. There's been a saying used over and over again. It talks about how the opposite of addiction is not recovery. The opposite of addiction is connection. And so when you think about this in context to COVID, the response to COVID is social distancing. It's isolation. It's don't leave your house unless you have to, which is in the direct opposite direction of what the solution for addiction and what substance use disorder is. And so in order to help our community with COVID, we've got this whole, the community trying to stay apart from each other, and the impact that's had on those with alcohol use disorder, opioid use disorder, substance use disorder has been tremendous. Just for an example, in Indianapolis, the central Indiana area, there are about 500 recovery meetings every week. 500. And that's not because they like to have extras. That's because of supply and demand. We need that many. That many are needed. They all shut down during pandemic. They all shut down. And so you've got an enormous amount of people who rely on these social supports, this connection to stay in recovery, that all of a sudden were cut off from that. And some of them did a good job pivoting to virtual type forums and ability to get online. But that's given that people have the ability to access online. And I think people lose that in the shuffle. We talk about, switching everything to virtual, and that's good. We need it. But there's a large group of people that are struggling that don't have access to devices, that don't have access to high-speed internet, that don't have access to the technology requirements. A lot of people that are really struggling, they rely on places like the library or McDonald's for their Wi-Fi, and those places were closed, and so they didn't have the ability to do so. People with medications having a hard time getting into doctors. You can poke in any area here and see how it has had a negative impact on those with substance use disorder for sure.
That's a haunting callback to both the presentation we heard earlier today from Chris Arnott about his work researching and documenting substance use disorder in New York City, as well as the previous panel on the digital divide and how it is wonderful that we have technology, but not everybody can access it, can't use the technology to access the services that they need. I want to turn a little bit to a slightly different topic, which is a lot of states provide services and are able to help set up meeting spaces for people with substance use disorder. What effect has the pandemic had on state-funded recovery services?
Well, I think that the pandemic has had a big financial impact across the board for everybody, right? You know, when states shut down, they're not collecting tax revenue. Indiana, we've got gaming, taxes that we rely on to fund part of that. There's actually a set aside, I think 3% of gaming tax goes to addictions related services. And when those are shut down, that money is not coming in. And so one of the main problems here in general is that the addictions treatment systems have been built separately from our general healthcare system. And so everything else is built into Medicaid and third payer sources, and it's built within our healthcare system, but addiction's treated over here to the side. And so in a lot of states, Medicaid, they won't even cover medications for addictions treatment. Some of this is funded through grants still because it's not really built into our systems. And so when states are looking at their budget, just like a family, a lot of times counseling, mental health, that bucket of money from a household is going to be the first person to get cut. You think about a family sitting around the dinner table and they've got to choose between food, transportation, shelter, and their counseling appointments or something along those lines. The first thing you're going to cut is that. And so when you think about our state leaders looking around the table on what they're going to cut, it was inevitable that there was going to be cuts to behavioral health in general. We've been really, really fortunate in Indiana. We're a very fiscally responsible state and had a really luckily, we had a surplus going into COVID that we ran through quickly, but we did have it nonetheless, where a lot of states did not have that. And so we were able to that took a lot of the sharp edge off of it. But everything's going to be on the table. We've seen a lot of states who's relied completely on state-funded grants to their community recovery partners that are completely gone. Some states slashed 80%. There's one state specifically in the South that had a robust initiative for the recovery community. And it is, it's not dead in the water, but it's been impacted severely. And so we're going to see that across the board. Indiana legislatively, we've got a budget session coming up, and we expect this is going to be the #1 topic, not just for addictions care, but budget related issues in general. So luckily, a lot of federal funds still flow in through all the state opioid response grants. So those programs are still up, going, and have been rather unimpacted. So we're grateful for that funding stream that's still available and supporting some of the programs.
Great, thank you. I want to step away from Brandon and Chief Justice Rush in Indiana and come over to our virtual hosts in West Virginia and start with Lois. West Virginia, as I think most people know, has been particularly hard hit by the opioid epidemic. So you already had big challenges coming into the COVID-19 pandemic and response. How has that affected your patients and your ability to serve them?
Brendan alluded to the fact that the opposite of addiction is connection. When the pandemic first hit us, we kind of panicked because we knew we were going to have a problem with folks being isolated from us and from one another. We started seeing folks in groups on telehealth, and we thought maybe we had a pretty good handle on that. It seemed to be working. We're all groups. They're seeing the doctor, they're seeing us. Until we started to realize 3 or 4 weeks into this that we were having some long-term sober folks return to use. And we weren't sure at that point whether it was the isolation and the fear of the COVID-19 or a combination of those things. So we let that happen for a couple of weeks, and then we thought we were literally losing patients. So we started bringing those folks in just a few at a time to see what the result of that was going to be. We never stopped seeing our most precarious patients. We always brought them in the office and had the PPE and all the gear that went along with that. But we finally, after about a 3-week trial period of bringing people back into the office, we started going ahead and seeing everybody face to face, full tilt. We knew that this was important, and we could not let people literally die because of an isolation, the isolation of COVID-19. So we are still seeing people here in the office. We're still taking new patients. One of the problems is that folks are not able to get the services they need, basic food, those kind of hygiene materials, those kind of things, because a lot of our patients have been furloughed from their jobs because of COVID. So we've got folks literally going hungry. So we have started bringing in 3 days a week prepared food. Everybody leaves here with a meal in their belly and a meal under their arm. We've also started 1 day a week bringing in fresh vegetables, produce with recipes. If folks have the wherewithal to be able to cook, then they've got things to cook for their families. There are some people that do some work here in an organization, and they do some harm reduction work in the street. And we have information that the overdoses just in the city of Charleston and in the surrounding areas, the overdose rate has increased 500%. That's just totally unacceptable to us. And we have folks that, like I said earlier, that have been furloughed from their jobs and have lost their insurance. And folks assume that they can't get treatment because they have no insurance. That's not the case. We take folks in this particular program that are uninsured, and we work with them and get them sober, and then we help them get insurance. But it has been a real challenge to make folks realize that they're still welcome here. They think because there's a pandemic, we're not going to see them. And they panic and they return to use, and they do the things that folks do to make themselves comfortable with that. So far we've not lost many people, but we have lost some. But we are very grateful to the folks around us that are interested in this, that deliver the food and prepare the meals and those kind of things. We couldn't do this by ourselves. So it takes all of us to make this happen.
It's fantastic to hear about the ways that you have adapted and are able to not just meet the health and treatment needs of your patients, but that you've also brought in the rest of the community to help deal with the food insecurity issues and the other challenges that they're facing. How has COVID-19 affected your ability, if at all, to make referrals to and collaborate with Brendan and West Virginia Legal Aid?
Well, there was a bit of a lag with the referral process. Brendan was coming in and seeing folks and setting in our groups and making those connections with folks and helping them that way. There was a bit of a lag in that process as we figured out the ins and outs of telehealth. And it's hard to refer a client who doesn't trust anyone to someone that's on a screen, right? So we have finally talked people into allowing us to let Brendan come and set in via telehealth. Even though the patient is here in the building, he's coming in by telehealth, and they know now they're starting to build that trust with him that we're not going to, refer them to somebody that we don't trust, and that they can trust him and they can let him help. They will help him. They let them help them get their legal issues worked out for them. So the tele part of it for that is beginning to work really well, and he's been a great help to our patients. Our long-term patients have had an association with Brendan for a long time, and they trust him. But it's the new folks that we're getting worked back into that trust situation, and it's beginning to work out very well for them. We've had some good successes with that.
Wonderful. We love to hear about successes anytime, but especially in such a drastically changed environment. Brendan, I just want to ask you the same question from your perspective. How has the pandemic affected your ability to accept referrals from and collaborate with Cabin Creek?
I mean, Lois nailed it to the core of it. And a medical legal partnership success is contingent on how effectively the attorney can be embedded into the clinic or into the hospital. I'm glad my constitutional law professor, Dean Taylor, mentioned reentry. People in our line of work make a lot of comparisons between individuals in reentry and individuals in recovery. They're both undergoing community reentry in some way or one another. In fact, there's a lot of overlap between the barriers they face. There's a significant number of steps required to get all of your identity documents in order, navigate a world without transportation or resources, and get back to that baseline level of success, which is, for most people, it's a low-paying job and a roof. Getting to that point can take weeks of navigating a system they don't know how to navigate. Throughout all these experiences, in addition to the experiences that landed them in those situations, there's a natural and often well-founded distrust of what they consider to be the system. And that distrust often extends to lawyers and to public services that are supposed to be on their side. At the start of the fellowship, I made it a point to be here if they wanted to talk. I was made sure that I was present at the clinic and group meetings, introducing myself, reminding them that I'm there. But it took a while for patients to realize, hey, Lois and the clinic trust this guy. Their peers in recovery see those peers talking to me during breaks. They realize they trust this guy. Maybe I'm different from the other people that actually weren't on their side in the past. I think that's the core nature of a successful medical legal partnership. And you can't achieve it with tear-off sheets, pamphlets, and other forms of referral. Cabin Creek has had a ton of success because they treat substance use disorder as Chief Loretta Rush pointed out, as a mental illness, but also treating the social determinants of health that revolve around that. They realize, you can't use opioids to treat pain, so they bring in physical therapists, psychologists, other people, behavioral therapists, and then still use the tried and true forms of 12 steps, group meetings, other forms. And then I was the legal component on it on top of that to address some socioeconomic issues for our clients. To kind of really understand what the opioid epidemic has evolved to during the pandemic requires an understanding of what people in the throes of substance use disorder on the street are going through. Lois gave you kind of a harrowing statistic on what that's like. The blip that we had in March to May, that 2-month period where all of the organizations we all work at were kind of figuring stuff out, people were falling through the cracks in droves during that period. And it's a sobering reminder for those of us who advocate for traumatized populations. We really only get to represent the survivors.
That is very true. You referenced at the beginning, you just started your Equal Justice Works Fellowship in 2019, and the work that you had done, the work that you did on the ground to introduce yourself to people and integrate yourself into the health center as a trusted partner. And then the world changed just a few months after you started your fellowship. How have you had to change your project in response to the pandemic?
Well, in the days and week leading up to March, I'd say all of us probably had a lot of plans that we didn't realize were going to change. For clients whose legal issues required interaction with various public services, whether it be a benefits office, DHHR, or just the DMV and courts, those all really got put on a 2-month hold while we waited for our courts and other services to reopen. Some of them still haven't reopened fully. I had hearings were scheduled 2 or 3 times out. I had plans to conduct some legal clinics at different recovery organizations, including educating recovery houses about new recovery-friendly laws coming out of West Virginia. And I had some project goals to make serious progress, as Chief Justice Loretta Rush pointed out, destigmatizing MAT and destigmatizing substance use disorder in some places where you wouldn't think you'd have to, including the courts and including public entities. As a member of a planning committee, I actually helped plan. We were planning to shut down the boulevard here downtown and have a citywide race that was called the Glow Run for Recovery. It was a huge success last year. This year, we made it happen. We made it virtual. We had people posting their stories all over Facebook, and it wasn't as, as out in people's faces as it could have been, but we did our best to make it work. Fingers crossed we get it next year, where that's where we put the money towards that we raised this time. Community education, though, about new laws has evolved into education about these eviction moratoriums, about the CDC's order, about pandemic unemployment and assistance, and honestly about stimulus checks. There's people out there who just didn't know how to get their stimulus checks, didn't know how to fill out those forms that all of us were able to navigate pretty quickly. So I guess I've shifted my clinic presence virtually now to these Zoom telehealth sessions, but really the focus has always been on addressing socioeconomic barriers. We know that tackling those barriers can drastically improve the social determinants of health. I educate clinic patients, providers, and the recovery community in general that a lot of the stigma that our client patients deal with in their daily lives can become actionable discrimination if it happens in the workplace, or in the job application process, or even in the courts. In the rural state of West Virginia, you've heard about a lot of the issues that we have, but the lack of access to transportation really is one of the biggest ones. It can make or break somebody's recovery because it's how they get to their treatment. It's how they get the prescription. It's how they get there to meet other people and see successful recovery stories. And if you don't have that, then there is no recovery process. For clients trying to reinstate driver's licenses, DMV pandemic protocols basically put on 1 to 2 month wait lists where I was scheduling skills tests a month or two out and an hour away at another regional office for people. That's a big ask for somebody who can't drive to go 2 hours away from where they live. Hopefully they have a friend who has a car to begin with that they can borrow, whatever it may be, but it's also a month or two that they're not working. A lot of people don't have a job they can walk to. There's no subway or metro to take to work. So they're not working, and all of the negative effects we talk about with the pandemic are just spiraling if you're just stuck at home with no sense of purpose. I spoke to another volunteer organization who does that street outreach, and I heard the story of a woman who had become homeless during the pandemic. She actually had lost her partner to an overdose and then lost her income and was just on the streets. And the only barrier for her to escape the homelessness that she was in was to go an hour away to the nearby county where her family was. And that was a 1 to 2 month long process for her to get that. Transportation is frankly deadly if it's lacking, depending on where you live. People can be stuck in a hauler surrounded by the triggers to their substance use disorder. For many people who have done everything they've been asked against all the odds, turn their lives around in long-term recovery, the one thing some people want above all else, one of the most significant driving factors for recovery, is they just want to see their kids again. One more time even. Navigating the family law system has never been easy, but for people in recovery, they've been beaten down with stigma and bias, hearing the harrowing words, "You don't deserve to see your kid again." The time the courts were closed caused a backlog, and COVID concerns were frequently used as a basis to deny visitation or custody exchanges. As Justice Corliss mentioned earlier, for many institutions, this crisis has accelerated and exposed the needs for not only our courts, but also for our larger comprehensive judicial system to get with the times. If we need visitation to be done, we need to make Zoom accessible for visitation centers. The same applies to our LSC advocates, though. We had to learn how to become virtually accessible. In lieu of sharing our private cell phones with clients, this meant auto-translating voicemails and calls to email transcriptions if we weren't in the office, and setting up Google Voice accounts, just balancing our accessibility to clients with our own personal lives and mental health to try to avoid advocate burnout. I'll circle back to the Collier question. I haven't changed my project. Equal Justice Works strongly values creativity and entrepreneurship in its fellows. And in response to the pandemic, we've only created new projects. We found ways to make the original project work in the new normal.
Excellent, thank you. I see that we're running up on time, but I did have just a couple of follow-up questions for the panelists. Unfortunately, they're related for each of them. So for Chief Justice Rush, I'm curious, what changes did have courts, either specifically in Indiana or that you've learned of nationwide, what kinds of changes to court access and processes do you think actually improved access that courts may consider keeping in place even after this kind of most critical stage of COVID-19 has passed?
I think some of the remote hearings will continue. I'm not going to say that I think there should always be remote hearings. I think for struggling with addiction and struggling with the disease, sometimes that connection of being there, seeing it, if you've ever seen like a Veterans Court graduation or seen that moment where you need some of that personal contact, I think it's important. But I also think that when people get through recovery and they get a job and they have to get points from work because they got to go to court, I think there needs to be a mix. And I think the same thing with treatment. I think we need to continue to have some of the remote. I think some of the incentives that we've come up with regard to family-centered incentives. I think, creative ones, given that the isolation, I think we need to look at it from that eye too. What can we do to build up that family, to make that family stronger? But I think the idea that you can access your court case by your phone is important. You continue to be able to do that. That if you cannot make court because you're in jeopardy of, I've got counseling, I can't go to my counselor this afternoon, I can't do my group, and I can't do court. We throw so many expectations on these people when they're involved with the court system. We want you to get a psychological evaluation, substance abuse evaluation, get a job, get housing, do this and that. But I think it's overwhelming for somebody that's already struggling with some core functions. So I think the wise use of some future technology to make it convenient and courts accessible to people so that they don't get penalized as they start getting their lives back on track are going to be key.
Great, perfect. Brendan, similar question. What changes have you adopted in your practice and to your program that you think you will continue even as things start opening up again?
Yeah, we've really realized what a burden it is to ask somebody to complete to what to many of us is a rudimentary office task, like signing and mailing documents. When you have limited resources, that can become a big part of your day. You have to go somewhere that has access to something that you don't. Whenever I mail out workflow documents now, I put in return envelopes with prepaid postage every time. I realize that can be massive for folks. I remind them they can email me or text me pictures of documents directly to my email, and I'm doing my best to limit expectations for documents being produced by clients for anything less than a crucial piece of evidence, with the understanding that our judges are knowing to be a little bit more understanding of maybe less than true and correct copies for every single exhibit. I'm asking clients on the front end, is it difficult for you to get to this courthouse, or do you have health concerns? If so, would you like me to request a telephonic or a video conference? On the front end for potential clients, phone interviews for basic intake and interviews, which I sometimes will conduct outside of my usual office hours, can make a huge difference in clients' lives because they have obligations to Lois and Cabin Creek to make their meetings and to do other things. And Cabin Creek's understanding of when they have time with me, but I don't want them to miss those, even if it's for a session with me. I want to make it work with their schedule. And at the end of the day, every trip they don't have to make for people who don't have transportation, that means that's one less time they have to ask a friend or a family member for a ride. And who knows how many times they've asked that person. That's not an unlimited reservoir of favors these people can pull from. The eviction crisis has reminded us what we already know, though. Virtually all of legal aid's clients, by the nature of our income guidelines, are really an emergency expense away from homelessness. I always make sure to ask clients for secondary or tertiary phone numbers and even addresses, because the last thing that I want to do as an advocate is close a case because I couldn't reach somebody, or God forbid, because they relapsed and the clinic couldn't reach them either. Everybody's on edge doing their best to make it through this. We're all experiencing higher levels of stress and grief. The seasonal depression some people feel is turning into what feels like a perpetual depression. For people in recovery from substance use disorder, those stressors are relapse factors. In the wake of the opioid epidemic, which is now the era we heard earlier of synthetic opioids like fentanyl, relapses have never been more deadly for people in long-term recovery. I'm going to continue to make myself as available as humanly possible.
Right. Thank you both. And I appreciate the point that you made about, taking burdens, using technology and other resources where available to take burdens off of people and lower expectations that they'll have to take time away from another obligation when they're really just trying to do their best to manage expectations and manage the things that they need to do to get into or stay in recovery. I think that's a really critical point. Brandon and Lois, I have a question for the two of you that's going to be really similar, which is, what additional supports do you think would be helpful to people in recovery during this time?
I know Brendan touched on this, but I can't say this enough about transportation is a huge problem here. We have four of our addiction programs are inside of primary healthcare clinics. 3 of those are extremely rural. We had a fella that hitchhiked 5 miles just to get to a bus to get here to the program. He was always late. of course, and we forgave him for that repeatedly. But then wintertime came, and he could not hitchhike 5 miles to get to a bus to get down here to see us. Transportation is a huge issue. We have an affiliation with Uber Health, who we can send Uber Health to pick a patient up, bring them to the clinic, get them back home, or get them to a doctor's appointments. We have physical therapy, we have acupuncture, we have massage therapy, we have equine therapy. But to get that patient to those places, if they live in a rural area, is impossible. Uber Health won't go up Cabin Creek Holler, as they say. You can't get an Uber driver to go up there. It's just too far. They don't make enough money for that. Transportation is just, I just can't. I've been asking my CEO for 4 years give me a bus, I'll drive it or whatever. But transportation is the biggest issue we face, and getting people into treatment, getting them into recovery, and keeping them there, because it is such a hard way to go for them to get here. Once we can get them here, we think we can do okay with them. We have 115 patients right now, and Brendan can tell you 35 of those folks have been sober for longer than a year. 10 of those folks have been sober longer than 3 years. So we do okay with that if we can get them here. And then, once they're here, we have contacts with housing. We have all these other things to do if we can get them here. So we really do need to figure out the transportation and some, we got all these other services, but we can't get folks there. So that's the biggest issue that we're facing.
Along those lines, I think that we really need to embrace some of the telehealth regulations that have changed. I don't know how we can change them back. With the emergency declarations, it's allowed us to provide telehealth services in a way that we were not able to before, specifically around prescribing buprenorphine and Suboxone. There was a rule in place that first visit had to be an in-person visit. And now, because of the emergency declaration, that's been waived. And so somebody can have their very first visit with the doctor. The doctor can write a prescription, call it into the pharmacy without that person actually having to physically go somewhere. And so, again, this is a temporary change, but it's something that we really need to look at making permanent. Again, that doesn't mean that should be the case for everybody, right? Like, we need to have people in front of doctors. We need to have them with that connection, but especially in the rural areas that are being discussed, this should have been a solution for the rural areas already. It's just COVID is really shining a light on how helpful that would be. So,
but in those rural areas, there's no internet, so there's no access to telehealth, and there's no, we can buy somebody a phone, but we can't get them access to, it just is all this quagmire that we're in. Yeah.
It is. And I think the point that Chief Justice Rush made about having options and having flexibilities that we have learned about or have learned to take better advantage of is really key to meeting people where they are and providing the services that they need in the form that will serve them best. I really want to thank all of you for speaking this afternoon, for sharing your thoughts, your experiences, and more than anything, your continued dedication to serving people with opioid use disorder and other substance use disorders to the best of your ability. I'm always honored to work with you and to hear about the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for joining us.